Hi everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 11th of October, where we are moving from our short story unit to the drama unit. Now, I should have returned journal number 1 to you, so if you have not received journal number 1, please let me know. Basically, as you know, journal number 1 was asking you to examine 3 short stories from the short story unit, and I was evaluating it informally on a checkmark system, and I wasn't evaluating for grammar or mechanics. It was as if we were having a conversation on paper. Plus would be an excellent, a check plus would be very good, and a check would be satisfactory. I'm happy to say that all the grades fell in that range. There also is a less than satisfactory and an unsatisfactory. And I'm hopeful that perhaps the journals might help you think about how to proceed with your first paper, which is a more formal exercise where you are being asked to examine one idea in one of the short stories that we have discussed. Paper number 1 I gave an extension for, and that is now going to be due on the 20th, which is Thursday. So I hope that you are working on paper number 1 at this point while we are moving forward and talking about Sophocles, who happens to be the author of our first drama, Oedipus the King. You'll see that I've indicated in the notes below that Sophocles was a statesman, a general, and a dramatist. So he was quite accomplished. There are over 120 play fragments that exist. Remember, this is in the 400s BC, Athens, Greece. A handful remain intact, and luckily for us, the Oedipus trilogy is a part of that handful. And that means that Oedipus the King is part of a 3-story drama cycle or a trilogy. After Oedipus the King is Antigone, happens to be the story of Oedipus's daughter as an adult. And then the last play is Oedipus at Colonus, where we revisit Oedipus as an old man. And I believe your textbook has Antigone in it, though it may not necessarily have Oedipus at Colonus. Though certainly you can find all 3 of these plays easily online if you wanted to read the story in its entirety. But we are just focusing on Oedipus the King. One of the ways that Sophocles helped to modernize theater for his time is he added a 3rd actor on the stage. One of the things to remember about Greek drama is that they were quite limited based on the limitations of the theaters that existed during the time period. So they oftentimes had to use very unusual conventions in order for us to be able to see and hear the actors. It's one of the reasons why I want us to watch a performance that tries to duplicate some of those unconventional adaptations that they would have utilized at that time period. The audience would have already known the plot, so they didn't need to necessarily rely on the actors in order to understand what was happening. 2 actors on stage is fairly easy to differentiate between the 2. Once you add a 3rd actor on the stage, it becomes a little bit more complex. It is probably one of the reasons why the costumes were so important in Greek drama, and oftentimes what they would do is wear these large masks that would show a particular facial expression so that you could differentiate between the actors. They'd also wear these large padded costumes, also platform shoes to make them larger than life. We think there were amplification devices in the masks that they wore. But the Greek theaters, which were basically carved out of the mountainsides, were marvels of acoustics. In fact, I'm going to ask you to watch a short video about this shortly so that you can get an idea what the Greek theater would have been like. So one thing that also Sophocles was known for was for reducing the role of the chorus, and that also seems to be a very archaic sort of theatrical convention, that they would have a large number of actors on stage who would be the chorus. They would represent basically the townsfolk, and they could either respond to the action that was happening, or they could also serve as a narrator and comment on it. But since Sophocles was expanding the role of 3 actors on stage at the same time, the chorus wasn't as necessary. Now, dramas at the time were for entertainment, but they were also religious observations. They were religious festivals to the god Dionysus. And keep in mind that we're talking about Greek society, a society of multiple gods, Dionysus being the god of wine and fertility. And they were hence funded by the state, that they were seen as vehicles to advance community and religious values. As I indicated, those Greek amphitheaters were basically rows of rising seats built into the hillsides. Over 14,000 people could sit in those amphitheaters, to give you an idea of just the sheer magnitude of it. And some of the theatrical conventions we have today originated in this time period. So you might have heard of Deus ex machina, God from the machine, which began in Greek times with mechanical stage devices. They would have a series of ropes and pulleys where they could lower a character onto stage from the heavens, or perhaps they could raise a character up to the heavens. And what it's come to mean now in contemporary times is any kind of artificial means to put a resolution onto a play. For instance, after we've seen an entire play, then basically we learn at the very ending that it was just a dream, for instance. So expect you are going to see these masks and padded costumes and platform shoes from the actors in the production that I'm going to be showing you next class, because I wanted to try to show you a production that gives you a historical sense, not that we have any eyewitnesses of what could have occurred. Expect to see the chorus chanting in unison. Of course, the fact that they are chanting in unison means that it's easier to hear, because they are all basically projecting their voices at once. And two of the themes that we expect to find in Greek drama are hubris, which is excessive pride, which is always punished, and catharsis. Catharsis is a purging of emotion. And this is where Aristotle comes into play. You might know Aristotle from his philosophy, but he also was a literary critic as well. And from his perspective, he talked about, in his work on tragic character, and of course we're reading a translation because we don't have the ability to read it in the original Greek. From his perspective, Oedipus the King might perhaps be the best tragedy that was ever written. And he defines some criteria that we should expect in tragedy. That, first of all, a tragedy should be complex. That makes sense because we've been talking all semester long about how literature itself should be complex. And it should be about something that's terrible, because obviously if it's tragic, it's supposed to be negative. And it's also something that's supposed to be piteous. And Oedipus the King is indeed piteous, that we're supposed to feel both pity for the main character because they experience such a tragic fate, but also fear because this person is supposed to be above and beyond the ordinary. And if they can experience a fall of this magnitude, then we can experience a fall of at least this magnitude, if not greater. And this main character was known as the tragic hero. And this would be a great individual, again, above and beyond the ordinary, someone that we could admire, someone who is above and beyond us, who experiences a downfall because of two reasons. The first being character flaw or flaws, oftentimes involving hubris, again, that excessive pride, but that not need be the only flaw. So that's part of the instructional element of the drama, is that we're supposed to learn not to duplicate the same errors from the main character. And also there are outside forces in play. In Oedipus the King, that means fate, something that is beyond our control. In contemporary times, we might refer to fate as luck. And as a tragic hero, this tragic hero ultimately accepts responsibility for the flaw or flaws in character. And that's going to be important when we watch Oedipus the King, because not every character will necessarily do that, but Oedipus will, which makes him the tragic hero. And again, as audience, we pity because he experienced such a terrible fall that wasn't all his fault. Part of it was because of outside forces. And also fear, because again, if they could experience this fall, we could also experience this fall. And the characters, at least according to Aristotle, should be characters that are necessary and are probable, which makes sense. They should be as realistic as possible within the confines of the play itself. You might have heard of the term Oedipal complex, and it was borrowed by Sigmund Freud from this play, Oedipus the King. Sigmund Freud took some liberties with it. And he, according to Freud's theory, his Oedipal complex, if you are taking psychology, this might sound familiar, that young boys have a sexual attraction to their mothers and that they see their fathers as competition. And there is also something called the Electra complex, which, at least according to Freud, would pertain to young girls who basically see their fathers as romantic interests and their mothers as competition. And Freud's theories have fallen out of favor, but if you know the plot of Oedipus the King, and of course the audience would have already known the plot of Oedipus the King, then we can see how Freud took this idea very liberally to create his own theory. So what is the plot of Oedipus the King, which again the audience would have known? And the play starts in media res, which means in the middle. And basically, we have Oedipus as a king who's trying to solve the riddle of why there is so much death and destruction in his kingdom, because a plague is ravaging the community. And as a good ruler, he's doing everything that he can to try to solve the reason why the gods are so angry that there is a plague upon the community. So Oedipus sends out various members of the community to consult with oracles. Remember, this is a time of oracles, to try to determine how they offended the gods so that they can rectify this situation and eliminate the plague. And everyone that Oedipus sends out basically comes back with the same information, that they've all been told that Oedipus himself is responsible for the plague. And he refuses to believe it. He is too arrogant and too proud to think that he could have anything to do with this horrific plague. He accuses those that he sends out of wanting to steal his kingdom or being malicious. And ultimately, as the play unfolds, more and more pieces of evidence are revealed. And what we learn, which of course the audience would already know, that's part of the fun, is that we know what Oedipus does not know. What we learn is that Oedipus indeed is responsible for the plague. So how did all of this come about? And this is where we get some backstory. Basically, when Oedipus was born, his biological parents went to an oracle, which was quite common at the time, to find out what their son's future would be like. And the oracle gave them a terrible prophecy and told them that their son would turn into an adult who would kill his father and marry his mother. His parents are horrified, and they decide that they need to do everything within their power to try to stop this horrible fate from coming to fruition. So they give the baby to a servant with instructions to the servant to kill the child. The servant feels pity for Oedipus. Remember, Oedipus's parents are the king and queen of the kingdom. And the servant, rather than killing the child, abandons the child on a mountaintop. And it just so turns out that a shepherd finds the child and gives the child to a neighboring community, another royal kingdom, whose king and queen are unable to have children. They raise the child as their own biological child and never tell the child that the child was adopted. This child grows into a man. This is Oedipus. And he consults the oracle to find out about his future when he's a man. And he's told that he is going to be facing a horrific fate, that he will ultimately kill his father and marry his mother. And Oedipus is horrified by this, and he decides that he needs to take action to stop this from coming to fruition. So he decides to leave his community, including his parents. Again, he doesn't know he's adopted. He believes he's leaving his biological parents. And it just so turns out on his journey along the way, there is someone at a crossroad who's blocking his way, and Oedipus becomes so infuriated by that he ends up killing everyone in that chariot, and that included, little did he know, his biological father. And then he continues on, and obviously anger is one of Oedipus's flaws. And then he continues on, and then ultimately he comes to a community that is ravaged by plague from a sphinx, which happens to be this monstrosity. And ultimately, the only way the plague can be stopped is if the Sphinx's riddle can be solved. There's an old literary tradition of monsters having riddles that need to be solved. No one in the community is able to solve this riddle. No one is smart enough to do it except for Oedipus. So he establishes a reputation for a great riddle solver. And the riddle, if you're curious, happens to be what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening. And the answer happens to be man. That 4 legs in the morning would be a human being in their youth when they're crawling, when they're babies. And 2 legs in the afternoon would represent adulthood, and that's when an individual walks upright. 3 legs in the evening would represent old age, and that would be walking with a cane. It just so turns out that the king of this community that was ravaged by a plague had recently been killed, which means that Oedipus can be rewarded for thwarting the Sphinx by being given the community, which means also that he gets the newly widowed queen, and that's Jocasta. And what we find out as the play develops is that this newly widowed queen ended up being Oedipus's biological mother, and they end up having children, which is a blood crime, incestual blood crime. And this is why the gods are angry at the beginning of Oedipus the King, because Oedipus, albeit unknown to him, has committed incest. But while we do know that fate plays a role in this, or destiny, so one of the questions we have to ask is how much free will do we have? How much control do we have over our lives? But there are also flaws within Oedipus's character that help to bring these terrible events to fruition. For instance, his terrible temper and his arrogance. So the audience would already know all of this as they're watching the play. Again, Freud took this and then very liberally adapted it for some of his psychological theories, which is probably how the play is best well known for. But from a literary perspective, Oedipus, not only from Sophocles' perspective, is a great tragedy, but it also helped to influence the great tragedists who came afterwards, including people such as Shakespeare, which is probably one of the reasons why Oedipus the King is so often studied. Now, again, as I indicated, this play would have been written in Greek poetry, so we're reading a translation. It's always tricky when you're reading a translation because you can never get the exact sense of a play. I've always said that I've never really read Oedipus the King. I've read many English translations, but I've never read it in the original because I don't speak Greek. That said, again, we don't necessarily have to be concerned with every nuance because it's more about the plot than it is about the language. That said, if you've got a good translation, you'll see that they tried to keep to the poetic forms of the play, that the play utilized poetry in order to forward plot. It was a technique that Shakespeare used as well. So, that said, when you are reading Oedipus the King, keep in mind that you don't necessarily have to understand every single word, and that different editions of the play and different performances of the play will have different translations. What we are more focused on are the characters and some of the themes within the drama itself. As I indicated, next class, what I wanted to do was to show you a performance that was done by the Canadian Shakespeare Company to try to duplicate what we might actually see in a Greek amphitheater in 430 BC. So at least it would give us a sense of what we would experience. But if you look at the notes below, you'll see that in section 3, it's entitled Amphitheater Video. It's 4 minutes long, and it basically gives you an idea of what Greek amphitheaters look like. So this will give you a sense of what it would have been like to actually see a performance in the Greek amphitheater. Because ultimately, although we will be watching a recording, they can't necessarily duplicate what we would experience in an amphitheater without seeing it through the lens of a camera. So we have to keep that in mind as well. We're not watching a live performance, and we're certainly not watching a live performance in a Greek amphitheater when we watch a recording, which we will do next class. So in terms of where we are, what I wanted to do for the attendance question was to backtrack a little bit and to do one last question about short stories. Now that we have put resolution onto the short story unit, I wanted you to choose one short story author that we have read this semester. And just to review, we read Gail Godwin's A Sorrowful Woman, Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour, William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, Ralph Ellison's Battle Royal, Jamaica Kincaid's Girl, and Raymond Carver's Popular Mechanics. So choose one of those authors and look up biographical or some biographical information about that author. And how does that biographical information help you better understand the author's story? So I suspect that you will all be choosing different authors so that at the ending of this exercise, we'll have a nice review of some biographical information of these authors and how that could be helpful for us understanding their stories. But again, we need to be cautious with biography. Just because an author has a biography, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's directly related to the content of their piece. It is fiction after all. But understanding an author's biography can shed new insight. So, in terms of how to go about this assignment, I would suggest that you utilize the databases in the GCC library. And if you aren't familiar with the databases, they seem very similar to online resources that you would find on the open internet. The difference, however, is that they are vetted, that they have a staff of individuals to review those pieces of information and verify their accuracy. And as you know, the internet is both a terrible and a wonderful thing. We've never had more access to information, but we've also have an incredible amount of misinformation because anybody can post anything on the internet. So you need to be careful when you're doing research on the internet. That's not to say that you shouldn't always be careful, even when you are using a database. That said, there is a little bit more of a reliability associated with databases because, again, they have been reviewed. And the GCC library, if you go onto the library site, you will see that they have a link there just for databases. And in fact, they even have, or they used to have, I believe they still do, a link that's just devoted to biography. You're not required to use the GCC databases. I'm not necessarily averse to you using the open internet. Just understand that you want to be cautious because ultimately when you're using the internet, it could be valid or it could be invalid information. I'm not even necessarily averse to Wikipedia, but just keep in mind that Wikipedia is a very general source that serves as a kind of summary. We really don't utilize that when we're doing serious academic research. It's useful as a starting point, but ultimately all it really does is summarize what some primary sources offer, which is really where you want to spend your time if you're doing serious research. But regardless of where you find the information about your particular author, I'd like you in the discussion section or the discussion form to briefly indicate a piece of information that you thought might be relevant to understanding the story and why you thought that information might be relevant to help increase your understanding. And as I indicated, you're not required to respond to your peers unless you're moved to do so, but you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses as well. So that should give you a good overview of all of the authors' biographies, because I suspect that by the ending again of this exercise that just about all of the authors will be addressed in one way or another. At least I hope so. But you get to choose the author. And that this gives you a little bit more insight into the short stories. Again, be very cautious with this information because these authors are ultimately writing fiction. And when we do literary analysis, we have to focus on the text itself. But again, knowing something about the author might be useful to you. So what we will do next class is that we will watch a performance of Oedipus the King, so I will provide you with that link. And you can see also, if you don't have access to the text Oedipus the King, in our topic section in the notes below, I've included a link where you can find the play. And understand that even though we are watching a performance of the play, that is not a substitute for actually reading the play. And of course, we've got several classes devoted to Oedipus the King, so there's time to read it and talk about it, as well as time to work on paper number 1. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. I will leave you to watch that 4-minute video about Greek amphitheater, and then answer, or at least do some research for our attendance question, and then answer our attendance question. Again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.